July 12th, 2025, 8:47 p.m. The dispatcher spoke with the kind of calm only years of routine could teach. But the woman on the other end, her voice trembled, cracked right down the middle. "He's been shot," she cried. "My husband, he's bleeding. He just walked in and someone shot him." Her name was Alondra Pierce. You could hear the panic in her tone, but also the strange clarity of someone already bracing for what came next. She gave the address, 1419 Gallows Creek Drive, tucked inside a neighborhood in Braddock Heights, Georgia, that had seen its share of hard times. Officers Miles Rankin and Tasha Elwood got there in just under 7 minutes. That's fast, but not always fast enough. They found a man, 29-year-old DeShawn Carter, collapsed just past the threshold of the apartment. Blood had formed a thick, still pool under his head. It crept slow across the tile, as if time itself had stopped moving. DeShawn was still breathing, barely. Officer Elwood dropped to one knee beside him, searching for a pulse. It flickered, weak. Rankin moved through the home, checking each room, weapon drawn. Nothing looked disturbed, nothing stolen, just stillness. Now, I've been around long enough to know, sometimes it's the silence that says the most. Alondra was seated behind the couch, barefoot, clutching her phone like it was the only thing anchoring her to the world. When Rankin found her, she looked up and said, almost too plainly, "I didn't see who it was. I just heard the shots. Then I hid." Before we go deeper into this story, take a moment to let us know where you're watching from. We always love hearing from you. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a single case. Some of them, like this one, will follow you long after the screen goes dark. Paramedics from Braddock County Fire and Rescue arrived at 9:02 p.m. They found DeShawn with 6 gunshot wounds, 2 in the chest, 1 in the abdomen, 2 in the left arm, and 1 that had traced its way into the soft side of his temple. By all rights, he shouldn't have survived the ambulance ride, but he did. They rushed him to Ellerbe Medical Center, where trauma surgeon Dr. Vivian Cho worked through the night. Later, she'd say she didn't know how he made it. But somehow, he did. Detective Calvin Merritt arrived at the scene not long after. The lights from the patrol cars painted the small apartment in red and blue like a warning, but inside, still neat, still quiet. The scent of jasmine from a half-empty plug-in lingered in the hallway. Merritt had seen scenes like this before, where everything looked normal except for the blood. The forensic team got to work. 6 shell casings, all 9mm, lay in a tight cluster near the door. No signs of struggle, no broken glass, no furniture overturned, just a damp towel on the counter, a few smudges on the inside handle, and blood, real and human, telling the only story it could. Alondra Pierce, 28, gave her statement just after 10 p.m., said she was watching TV, some dating show, when she heard the front door open. Then almost immediately, the gunshots. She told Merritt she dove behind the couch and stayed there, waited 3 or maybe 4 minutes before crawling out and finding her husband on the floor. Said she didn't hear anyone leave, didn't see anything, just heard the noise and froze. Merritt wrote it all down. He didn't say much, just looked around that tidy little apartment, the one with no sign of a fight, no panic, no chaos. And he wondered, as only seasoned detectives do, Why does this feel so arranged? Detective Calvin Merritt had been on the job long enough to recognize when something didn't sit quite right. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but he trusted the weight in his chest when a story felt too smooth. That night, after the paramedics cleared the scene and the blood was tagged and logged, he sat across from Alondra Pierce in interview room 3. She looked calm, too calm maybe. No smudges of blood on her hands. Her clothes were clean, slightly wrinkled from sitting, but not torn or stained. Her fingernails were manicured, unchipped. No powder residue, no marks on her arms, nothing out of place. Merritt started simple. Tell me again what happened. Alondra leaned forward just enough to seem earnest. I was watching TV. The door opened. I heard gunshots. I dropped behind the couch and waited. When it got quiet, I got up, and he was on the floor. Merritt nodded, jotting notes like a man who had all the time in the world. Did you hear any voices? Number just shots. Footsteps? Number nothing. She wasn't nervous. That Merritt found peculiar. Most people, when they've just seen the person they love bleeding out on the floor, shake, cry. Their words trip over themselves. But Alondra? Her answers came straight, steady, measured like teaspoons. He glanced down at his notepad. Do you know of anyone who'd want to hurt DeShawn? She paused for the first time. No, she said finally. He's not like that. Everyone liked him. Merritt looked up just long enough to meet her eyes. She didn't flinch. Back at the scene, forensic techs had already begun examining the physical details. No forced entry, no signs of tampering with the locks. The door had been closed gently enough that the latch hadn't even clicked fully into place. That suggested someone had left in a hurry, or someone had never truly intended to slam it shut. Latent prints were lifted from the door, side table, and countertop, but none of them matched anyone outside the household. No signs of a third party yet. In the kitchen sink, they found a single drinking glass. Water still inside, no lipstick, no fingerprints. A forensic photographer noted the direction of blood spray. Tight, direct, and low. The shots had come from close range, likely within 5 feet. That didn't fit with someone firing from the doorway. It matched someone already inside, someone waiting. That thought didn't make it into the report yet. But it lived in Merritt's mind, setting up camp. The next morning, Merritt walked into Ellerby Medical Center to check on DeShawn Carter. He wasn't conscious. The machines around him beeped steadily, keeping time with the clock on the wall. It was quiet in the room, almost reverent. He spoke briefly with Dr. Cho, who confirmed what the report already said. DeShawn had survived what should have killed him. The bullet that grazed his temple hadn't fully penetrated. A matter of millimeters. That's what saved him. Merritt nodded, absorbing the facts, but his thoughts kept drifting back to that living room, to Alondra's steady voice, her clean hands, her silence that didn't ring true. Now, I've always believed that grief has a rhythm. It doesn't have to look a certain way, but it feels a certain way. And what Merritt felt in that room, what he heard in that interview, wasn't grief. It was choreography. A dance she knew too well, and it had only just begun. Detective Merritt had always believed that truth doesn't hide. It lingers It clings to corners, waits in the quiet, and sometimes it shows up in the smallest things, like a smudge on a doorknob or the way a towel folds in a rush. 2 days after the shooting, he returned to the apartment at 1419 Gallows Creek Drive, not because he had to, but because something kept gnawing at him. The layout hadn't changed. The blood was gone, cleaned by a professional service, but the rest remained. The jasmine scent was still in the air. The couch sat neat. The floors gleamed, and yet something about the silence had grown louder. He walked the path from the door to the couch, retraced where Alondra said she had dropped down. The line of sight was clear. From behind that couch, she would have seen the door, would have seen DeShawn stumble in, and maybe would have seen who pulled the trigger. Later that afternoon, Merritt pulled up the call logs and body cam footage from the night of the incident. Officer Rankin's footage caught the very moment Alondra was approached. Her face was pale, yes, her voice soft, but her shirt sleeves were rolled up neatly. Her hair untouched, not a drop of blood on her. He paused the footage, rewound, watched it again. He'd seen trauma before. Real trauma was messy, emotionally, physically. The people closest to violence wore it, even if only in their eyes. Alondra didn't. Then came the detail that didn't drift. The towel. Crime scene photos showed it draped over the kitchen counter, a pale green cloth with a slight bleach stain at one corner. The forensic report hadn't flagged it. No blood, no trace. But Merritt remembered it all the same, because it was too clean, too placed. Like it was meant to look used, but hadn't been. At the precinct, Merritt met with Officer Elwood. She had something she hadn't thought was important at first. When she checked Alondra's hands for injury, she noticed faint red marks along her thumbs. Not scratches, more like pressure lines, as if from holding something tight for too long. Could have been from the phone, she said. Merritt nodded. Or a gun. He didn't say it loud, just enough to let the thought breathe. There's a rhythm to guilt, Merritt always said. It doesn't gallop. It creeps. It comes in sideways, through timelines that don't hold, and stories told a bit too well. And now, the story Alondra told was starting to feel rehearsed. Too clean, too calm, like she'd practiced it in the mirror more than once. By the end of that week, Merritt submitted a request for the digital forensic team to image Alondra's phone, not because he had proof, but because sometimes what a person deletes tells you everything they wanted you to believe. By the start of the next week, Alondra Pierce's phone was no longer just a piece of evidence. It was a storyteller. And as it turned out, it remembered more than she ever intended. Detective Merritt met with the digital forensics tech, a quiet guy named Preston, who never said much unless it was important. That morning, he had plenty to say. "We pulled a full image," Preston said, tapping on the screen. "She deleted a lot, but not well." They found a string of deleted messages, dozens actually, between Alondra and a contact saved under a fake name, R. West. The messages weren't threatening. They were casual, familiar, some flirtatious, some logistical. And then came one from the night before the shooting. "You remember the back entrance, right? Quiet, no cameras." And another. "He's usually home around 8:30. I'll leave it open." That was sent at 7:14 p.m., on July 12th. Just a little over an hour before DeShawn Carter walked through his front door and into 6 bullets. Merritt read through the thread slowly. Alondra's tone didn't read like someone being coerced. There was no fear, no pressure, just planning. They pulled location data next. Her phone had pinged off the home Wi-Fi at 8:42 p.m., consistent with her story. But what she didn't know was that her photo roll, though empty, still carried metadata. Preston pulled up a deleted photo taken at 8:44 p.m. The screen showed a blurry shot of the front hallway. In the corner, the timestamp was embedded 8:44:6. And in the very bottom right, barely visible, a shoe, not hers, men's, dark, athletic style. Someone else had been inside the apartment, and Alondra had taken a photo of it. Merritt stared at the image. Now, it's a strange thing, watching someone lie without speaking, but that's exactly what this was, a lie told in silence, in the language of deleted files and timestamps. He felt it settle in his chest, heavy, cold. She hadn't just known someone was there. She let him in. There was more. The phone search history revealed an inquiry made 2 weeks prior, how to clean gun residue off hands quickly. And another, Georgia's self-defense laws spouse shooting. She'd wiped the browser cache, but not the logs. Rookie mistake. Merritt leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. It wasn't quite a confession, not yet. But it was close, real close, the kind of close that doesn't make noise, just pressure. By the end of the day, the DA's office had what they needed to open a formal inquiry. Merritt wasn't ready to make an arrest, not yet. He wanted one more piece, one final move. He picked up the phone and called Ellaby Medical. DeShawn Carter had just come out of his medically induced coma, and he was asking for his wife. DeShawn Carter opened his eyes on the morning of July 18th, 6 days after the shooting. 42 stitches, a collapsed lung, a skull fracture that missed killing him by less than a quarter inch. He didn't speak right away. The nurses said he just blinked, looked around the room, seemed confused, then focused, like a man trying to piece something back together, one image at a time. Detective Merritt got the call around 8:15 a.m. He was already at his desk, sipping lukewarm coffee, staring at a whiteboard covered in names, arrows, and question marks. The moment he heard DeShawn was conscious, he grabbed his coat and went straight to Ellaby Medical. Room 412 was quiet. The machines hummed, soft and steady. DeShawn looked thinner than Merritt remembered. He was awake, yes, but still pale, still slow. "Morning?" Merritt said gently. DeShawn's eyes tracked to him. No smile, no fear, just curiosity. "You remember what happened?" There was a long pause. Then DeShawn nodded. "I came home," he said, voice rough like gravel. Front door was open. Merritt's eyebrows lifted. "Open?" DeShawn nodded again. Not wide, just not latched. He spoke in short bursts, said he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The lights were off. He called out. No answer. Then came the gunfire. "Where was Alondra?" Merritt asked. Another pause, this one heavier. "In the kitchen," he said. "I saw her just for a second." "You sure?" DeShawn's voice cracked. "I thought she was hiding." but she looked right at me, didn't move. Merritt said nothing. DeShawn leaned back into the pillow. I thought she was scared, but now, I don't know. It's a hard thing, watching a man try to rebuild trust in real time. You could see the doubt crawl across his face like a shadow, because memory, it doesn't just come back. Sometimes it arrives with new questions. Merritt didn't push him. He left after 15 minutes, thanked the nurses, walked back to his car, and just sat there for a moment. If DeShawn had seen Alondra, even briefly, and she hadn't moved, hadn't screamed, hadn't tried to stop it, that changed everything. It wasn't just that she let someone in, it was that she might have stood still while it happened. That's not accessory, that's intent. Later that afternoon, Merritt pulled security footage from a gas station half a block from Gallows Creek Drive. It wasn't much, but at 7:56 p.m. on the night of the shooting, a man matching the height and build of the unknown contact R. West was seen walking southbound. Black hoodie, baseball cap, nothing identifying. But the timestamp was enough. And Merritt knew if they could match that face to a phone number, they'd have their next piece. DeShawn had remembered just enough to light the fuse. Now it was time to follow the burn. Some names aren't real. They're placeholders, smoke screens, disguises that work just long enough to get someone hurt and someone else free. Detective Merritt knew that R. West wasn't real, not as listed. The number had no name attached, prepaid, burned after July 13th. But what people forget is that phones don't just call and text. They leave footprints, location pings, tower hops, metadata. He brought in Detective Lila Contreras from the cyber unit, smart as a whip, sharp-eyed, and patient as bedrock. Together, they pulled triangulation data from the cell provider. The R. West phone had pinged near a rundown gas station on Halpern Avenue at 7:52 p.m. the night of the shooting. 3 minutes later, the gas station's outside security cam caught a tall man in a black hoodie heading south on foot. The footage wasn't perfect, fuzzy, grainy, but it gave them a stride, a building, a direction. They followed the path, footage from a laundromat 2 blocks down, then a church parking lot, all time-stamped, all consistent. Whoever he was walking straight toward Gallows Creek Drive. Then at 8:07 p.m., he vanished. That was 1 block from the apartment. Contreras pulled something else. When the R. West phone connected to a cell tower at 8:12, it was just long enough to auto-upload a small packet of app data. That data included device identifiers. A match popped in a state DMV photo database, attached not to R. West, but to a man named Reggie Sorrells. 29, prior for possession, no violent record, no fixed address, but a sister who lived 3 blocks from Alondra. Merritt stared at the photo. He recognized the jawline from the gas station footage. It was a match. That's the thing about the digital world. It remembers what you try to forget. You can burn the phone, ditch the hoodie, but signals still hum, towers still listen, and even strangers leave shadows. Now they had a name. Reggie Sorrells was brought in on a bench warrant 2 days later. He didn't run, didn't argue, just looked tired. In the interview room, he asked for water, drank it slow. Merritt watched him across the table. "You know why you're here?" he asked. Reggie nodded. "I figured. We got you on camera, Reggie. Got your phone. Got the text." Reggie's eyes didn't flinch. "You talked to her yet?" "Who?" "You know who?" Merritt leaned back. "Alondra?" Reggie exhaled through his nose. She made it sound like he hit her, like she was scared, said she just needed someone there in case things got bad. Merritt stayed quiet. Reggie shook his head. "I didn't plan to shoot, I swear. She left the door open. I walked in, and then it just happened, like it wasn't even me." Merritt wrote down every word, slowly, because what Reggie just confessed wasn't just about him, it was about Alondra. And suddenly, her silence meant something else entirely. Alondra Pierce never held the gun. That much everyone agreed on. But by the time Merritt pieced everything together, it was clear she didn't have to. The setup had started weeks before the shooting. Phone records showed Alondra had been texting Reggie Sorrells for over a month under various names. R. West, D. Lang, even just in one thread. Every time a number got too active, she switched to a new burner. But the story never changed. "He's angry again. I don't know what to do. Sometimes I think the only way out is if something happens to him." They weren't instructions, but they were breadcrumbs. And Reggie? He followed them. Detective Merritt laid it all out on the board. Timeline, texts, footage pinged. It was a symphony of subtlety, each part quiet on its own, but together, loud as a shot in the dark. Alondra never asked Reggie to pull the trigger. She just built the stage, lit it, and opened the door. Reggie's statement confirmed it. She'd invited him in, left the door unlocked, and stepped out of view. She knew what would happen, or at the very least, she no longer cared if it did. There's a kind of guilt that doesn't show up in courtrooms, the kind you can't measure in years or minutes. It lives in what you could have stopped but didn't, in what you knew and allowed. The prosecution faced a challenge. Legally, it was delicate. Alondra hadn't pulled the trigger. She hadn't purchased the weapon. She hadn't even left fingerprints at the scene. But the DA had a strategy. Conspiracy to commit aggravated assault and accessory before the fact to attempted murder. They couldn't get her on murder, but they could show she'd built the machine and let someone else push the button. When Merritt sat down with the DA and walked through the evidence, it was clear they had enough to move forward. Not a slam dunk, but enough. He looked at the board one last time. DeShawn's route, Alondra's silence, Reggie's confusion, the bullet path, the unlocked door. A tragedy plotted without blueprints, just suggestion, emotion, and a willingness to let things happen. Alondra was arrested on August 3rd, 2025. She didn't cry, didn't protest. When asked if she wanted a lawyer, she simply said yes. And as Merritt walked her down the hallway to booking, he didn't feel triumph. He just felt tired. Because this kind of story doesn't end with a gavel. It ends in the silence left behind. Courtroom 2B of the Braddock Heights County Courthouse wasn't designed for drama. The walls were beige, the chairs creaked, and the clock at the back hadn't worked in 3 years. But on October 14th, 2025, the room held something heavier than silence. Alondra Pierce sat at the defense table, flanked by her attorneys. Her face was unreadable, not stoic, not shattered, just still, as if the verdict had already lived inside her for weeks. The prosecution laid out the case with precision. Phone records, timelines, deleted messages, Reggie Sorrell's testimony, and then finally, DeShawn Carter himself. He walked into the courtroom with a slight limp, a faint scar near his temple. He looked at Alondra just once. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just looked. Then he turned to the jury. "She said she loved me," he began, "and I believed her." His voice didn't shake, but something in the room did. He spoke for less than 5 minutes. He didn't accuse, didn't plead, just told them what he remembered, what he thought he saw, what he felt when the door opened and the world he knew shut behind it. Then he sat down and never looked at her again. Alondra never testified. Her attorneys argued she hadn't known what Reggie would do, that she was vulnerable, misled, afraid. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found her guilty on 2 counts: conspiracy to commit aggravated assault and accessory before the fact to attempted murder. She was sentenced to 18 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 12. She showed no emotion. When the sentence was read, she stood. She didn't cry. She just whispered, "Okay." Now, I've been around long enough to know some endings don't come with closure. Some just come, like the last page of a book that never tells you who to forgive. And when they led her out of the courtroom, the only sound left behind was the rustle of her steps. DeShawn Carter left Braddock Heights 3 weeks later, moved west, new job, new town, no interviews, no articles, just gone. Detective Merritt stayed on the force another year, then retired, bought a boat he never sailed, took up woodworking, built things that didn't bleed. Sometimes when the nights got quiet, he'd think about the case, not because it haunted him, but because it reminded him how quiet evil can be, how easy it is to miss when you're only listening for screams. Some stories end with justice, others with survival, and some, like this one, end with the slow, quiet sound of someone learning how to live again, with a weight they never asked to carry. Well, if you stayed with me all the way through, I sure appreciate the company. Go on and tap that like and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this, told slow and easy, right here by the firelight. Take good care now.